The night air was cool as Andrew finished his speech at the community center. People clapped and shook his hand, thanking him for organizing the fundraiser that would help build a new playground for the neighborhood kids. Andrew felt good. His work as a small business owner and community helper was making a real difference in the lives of local families. "Great job tonight," said his friend Terrell, patting him on the back. "You raised over $5,000. Andrew smiled, his dreadlocks swaying slightly as he nodded. 10 years growing these locks, and they've seen all my biggest achievements." He ran his fingers through his hair, a habit he'd developed over the decade since he'd started growing it. Each lock told a story. They had been with him when he opened his shop, when he started the community program, when he received the city's Community Service Award. The clock showed just past 10 p.m. when Andrew said his goodbyes. He was tired but happy as he got into his car, a modest sedan he'd bought 3 years ago. The drive home would take about 20 minutes, just enough time to wind down before bed. He was only 5 minutes from home when he noticed the flashing lights behind him. Andrew checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. Maybe a taillight was out. He signaled properly and pulled over to the side of the road smoothly, just as his father had taught him years ago. 2 officers approached his car, one on each side. Andrew rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. "License and registration," the taller officer said sharply, not bothering with a greeting. His nameplate read Officer Briggs. His partner stood watching from the passenger side, hand resting near his belt. "Yes, sir," Andrew said calmly. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." The officer nodded curtly, his flashlight beam uncomfortably bright in Andrew's eyes. Andrew moved slowly, keeping his movements clear and visible. He handed over his documents and waited quietly while the officer examined them. "Where are you coming from this late?" Officer Briggs asked, his tone suggesting there was something suspicious about being out at 10 p.m. "A fundraiser at the community center on Oak Street," Andrew explained. "I was helping raise money for a new playground." The officer made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Step out of the car, please." Andrew was confused but complied. "May I ask why, officer? Have I done something wrong?" "I smelled something suspicious," said Officer Briggs, though Andrew knew there was nothing to smell. "We're going to search your vehicle." A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. A woman was holding up her phone, recording. Andrew stood quietly as the officers searched his car, pulling things out of his glove compartment and looking under seats. "Those are some interesting hair things you got there," the second officer commented, pointing at Andrew's dreadlocks. "How do you even keep those clean?" Andrew didn't answer, knowing the question wasn't really looking for information. The search went on for nearly 30 minutes. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Still, Officer Briggs returned with a stern look. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands behind your back." "What? Why?" Andrew asked, genuine shock in his voice. "I haven't done anything wrong." Resisting an officer's instructions, Briggs said loudly, glancing at the small crowd watching. "Suspicious behavior." The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Andrew's wrists as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Everything had been fine just an hour ago as people thanked him for his community work. Now he was being pushed into the back of a police car while neighbors watched. "Be careful with his fancy hair," one officer said to the other with a smirk, probably hiding all sorts of things in there. As the police car pulled away, Andrew caught a glimpse of his neighbor rushing to call his family. This wasn't supposed to happen to people who followed the rules, who helped their community, who did everything right. But it was happening, and the look in Officer Briggs' eyes told Andrew that the night was far from over. The county jail smelled of bleach and something else Andrew couldn't name, a mix of fear and lost time perhaps. Officer Briggs pushed him through processing while a tired-looking desk officer typed his information into an old computer. "I need to call my lawyer," Andrew said. The desk officer barely looked up. "Phones are down for maintenance, maybe tomorrow." Andrew knew that wasn't true, but arguing would only make things worse. His dreadlocks, usually neatly tied back, had come loose during the rough ride to the station. He tried to smooth them with his cuffed hands, a small attempt to keep some dignity in this undignified place. "Look at him fixing his hair like he's going to a photo shoot," Officer Briggs laughed to another officer who had joined them. The second officer's name had read Wilson. Never understood why they wear it like that, Wilson replied, loud enough for Andrew to hear. Probably hasn't been washed in years. Andrew bit his tongue. His locks were meticulously maintained, cleaner than the sticky floor of this precinct. Each twist represented years of growth, patience, and connection to his roots. His grandmother had helped him start them 10 years ago, teaching him the cultural significance behind each careful twist. They took his belongings, wallet, phone, keys, watch, and handed him a plastic bag with an orange jumpsuit inside. Change, barked a guard, pointing to a small room with no door, just a half wall that offered minimal privacy. Ando changed slowly, folding his fundraiser clothes, dress pants and a button-up shirt, as neatly as possible. The jumpsuit was too large and smelled like it hadn't been washed properly. What exactly am I being charged with? Andrew asked as the guard led him down a narrow hallway. Processing will tell you in the morning, the guard answered flatly. The cell was small with 2 metal beds bolted to the wall. Andrew's cellmate, an older man with graying hair, barely glanced up when the door clanged shut. First time? The man asked after the guard left. Andrew nodded, sitting carefully on the empty bed. Name's Ray, the man said. What did they bring you in for? Existing, I think, Andrew replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. I was driving home from a community fundraiser. Ray nodded knowingly. Same reason I've been here 3 days waiting for my court appearance. Broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. The night stretched painfully slow. Andrew couldn't sleep on the thin mattress, worry gnawing at him. What about his business? He was supposed to open the shop tomorrow. What would his customers think? What about his elderly mother who depended on him? Around midnight, the cell block had finally quieted when heavy footsteps approached. Officer Briggs appeared with Wilson and a third officer Andrew hadn't seen before. Health and hygiene inspection, Briggs announced, a strange smile playing on his lips. Ray sat up, confused. There's no inspection scheduled. Shut it, old man, Watson snapped. Not for you. Him. He pointed at Andrew. The third officer unlocked the cell. Come with us. Andrew stood cautiously. What's this about? New policy, Briggs said, though his smirk suggested otherwise. All that hair's a hygiene risk. Could be hiding anything in there. Andrew backed up against the wall. No. My hair is clean and properly maintained. There's no policy about this. You refusing to comply with officers? Wilson stepped forward, hand on his belt. Ray stood up. I've been here 20 times over 30 years. There's no such policy. The officers ignored him, grabbing Andrew by the arms and dragging him out. Andrew struggled, not violently but firmly. This is wrong. You can't do this. They pulled him into a small room with a single chair and a counter with electric clippers. Andrew's heart pounded as realization dawned. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly. These locks are part of my culture, my identity. They've taken years to grow. Should have thought about that before you gave us trouble, Briggs said, nodding to the others. They forced him into the chair, one holding each arm while Briggs picked up the clippers. Department policy says we need to check for contraband, he said, turning on the clippers with a menacing buzz. Andrew closed his eyes as the first lock fell to the floor. He thought of his grandmother's hands guiding his when he first started growing them, her stories of ancestors who wore their hair as a crown of honor. With each buzz of the clippers, another piece of his identity fell away. By the time they were finished, the floor was covered with 10 years of growth, 10 years of memories. His head felt strangely light, exposed, cold. That said Briggs, finally stepping back. Now you're up to code. Dawn broke over the neighborhood as Tanya rushed up the steps of her law school, phone pressed to her ear. She hadn't slept since getting the call about her brother. What do you mean they shaved his head? She asked Ray, who had used his one phone call to reach out to Andrew's family after witnessing what happened. It wasn't right. Ray's voice crackled through the phone. Been in and out of this system 30 years and never seen anything like it. They singled him out, called it a hygiene inspection. Your brother tried to explain how important his hair was, but they didn't care. Tanya's hand trembled as she ended the call. Her brother's dreadlocks weren't just hair. They were started the day their grandmother passed away, a connection to her memory and their heritage. She skipped her morning class and headed straight to Professor Rivera's office. He ran the law school's civil rights clinic and would know what to do. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the county jail. The story had spread through the community like wildfire. A respected business owner arrested on bogus charges, then stripped of his cultural identity while in custody. Mrs. Washington, who lived across from Andra, brought her church group. Mr. Lee closed his restaurant for the day to join the protest. Teenagers from the community center where Andra had organized the fundraiser made signs reading "Justice for Andra" and "Hair is Heritage." Local news vans parked along the street as reporters interviewed neighbors. "He fixed my grandson's bike for free when I couldn't afford repairs," one elderly woman told a reporter. That's the kind of man Andra is, always helping, never causing trouble. Inside the jail, the shift supervisor was fielding angry phone calls. The department's social media pages were flooded with comments demanding answers. Why was Andra arrested? Why was his hair cut against his will? Where was the footage from the jail cameras? The system was experiencing technical difficulties during that time period, the department spokesperson repeated robotically to journalists. And the haircut was standard procedure for hygiene purposes. But that excuse fell apart when former detainees began speaking out. "I was in there last month with hair longer than his," said one white man with shoulder-length hair who had been arrested at a protest. Nobody even mentioned cutting it. By mid-afternoon, Professor Rivera arrived at the jail with 3 law students, including Tanya. "We're here to represent Andra," he told the desk officer firmly. "And we want to see the logs of everyone who's been processed in the last 6 months. We want to know how many others had forced haircuts as part of this so-called standard procedure." The officer looked uncomfortable. "You'll need to file a formal request for those records." "We already have," Tanya said, sliding a document across the desk. "And we've contacted the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." News of the community response reached Andra in his cell. A sympathetic guard whispered that people were gathering outside, that his story was spreading. Andra sat on the edge of his bed, running his hand over his now bare scalp. The skin felt foreign, exposed. Each time his fingers found only skin where his locks should be, his stomach tightened. But hearing about the community's response stirred something else in him, determination. His cellmate Ray nodded toward the small window. "Your people are out there. Don't let those officers think they broke you." In a small office at the police station, Officer Briggs was being questioned by Internal Affairs. An anonymous officer had come forward, uncomfortable with what had happened. "It was just a haircut," Briggs insisted, shifting in his seat, "for safety reasons." "Then why wasn't it documented in the processing report?" asked the investigator. "And why was it done at midnight instead of during intake?" Across town, Tanya met with community leaders in a packed church. People stood along the walls and sat in the aisles. "My brother has always fought for this community," she told them, her voice strong despite her exhaustion. "Now it's our turn to fight for him." They organized shifts to keep the protest going around the clock. Local businesses sent food and drinks. A barber offered free haircuts to raise money for legal fees. As night fell again, the crowd outside the jail had grown larger. They held electric candles that glowed in the darkness, a beacon of light for Andra to see from his small cell window. "They thought cutting your hair would shame you, would make you hide," Ray told Andra as they looked out at the lights. But look what it did instead. It woke people up. The law office of Diane Chen buzzed with activity. Papers covered every surface as she and Tanya prepared for Andra's preliminary hearing. Diane had been fighting civil rights cases for 20 years, but this one had touched a nerve in the community unlike any she'd seen before. "The department claims the security footage from that night is corrupted," Diane said, tapping a formal letter from the police. "Convenient, isn't it?" Tanya pushed her glasses up her nose, exhaustion evident on her face. "But we have Ray's witness statement and 3 other former inmates who were there that night. And this," Diane held up a thick folder, "records of every inmate processed in the past year. Notice anything?" Tanya flipped through the pages, scanning the processing notes. No mention of haircuts for hygiene purposes. Not once. "Exactly. Whatever they did to your brother wasn't procedure. It was targeted." Outside the office window, they could see news vans still parked near the courthouse. Andrew's story had spread beyond their city, picking up national attention. Hashtags demanding justice trended on social media. Celebrities and civil rights leaders had released statements of support. Meanwhile, in a small visitor room at the jail, Andrew sat across from Professor Rivera, who had joined his legal team. "The hearing is tomorrow," Rivera explained. "The officers will be there. They'll try to make what they did sound reasonable, procedural." Andrew nodded, still not used to the feel of air on his scalp. 3 days had passed since they'd cut his locks, but each morning he woke expecting to feel their familiar weight, only to be reminded of their absence. "I've been thinking about something," Andrew said quietly. "They wanted to shame me, right? They expected me to walk into that courtroom embarrassed, head down, trying to hide." Rivera watched him carefully. "That's often the point of these kinds of acts, to dehumanize, to create shame." "What if I don't hide it?" Andrew leaned forward. "What if instead of trying to cover my head or downplay what happened, I walk in there with my head high, make them look at what they did?" A slow smile spread across Rivera's face. "Turn their weapon against them." That evening, Andrew's mother visited. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw his shaved head, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his scalp. "My baby," she whispered, "your beautiful hair." "It'll grow back, Mama," Andrew said, taking her hand. "But right now, this is the truth they need to see." His mother nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle. "Coconut oil," she said. "If you're going to show the world, let your head shine with pride, not shame." Back at Diane's office, the legal team worked into the night. They had compiled evidence of similar cases across the state, incidents where certain detainees faced different treatment than others. They found department policies that had been violated. They prepared questions that would expose the officers' true motivations. "What are you going to wear tomorrow?" Tanya asked her brother during their evening call. "The suit Grandma bought me when I opened my shop," Andrew replied without hesitation. "The one she said would make people take me seriously." The night before the hearing, Andrew lay awake in his cell, too anxious to sleep. Ray, who had been released but was coming to court to testify, had left him with words that kept repeating in his mind. "They wanted to cut away your pride. Show them they only made it stronger." Andrew ran his hand over his smooth head, remembering the weight of his locks, the stories and years they had contained. But as he felt the bearskin, he realized his grandmother's voice was still there, her lessons still with him. They hadn't cut away his heritage, it lived inside him. By morning, he had made peace with what had happened and what was to come. When the guard came to escort him to the courthouse holding cell, Andrew stood tall. "You're looking mighty confident for someone in your position," the guard commented, surprised by Andrew's demeanor. Andrew just smiled slightly. "Sometimes the position you're in isn't the one they think you're in." As he was led through the corridors toward the transport van, inmates and staff alike turned to look. Some had heard his story. Others just noticed the confidence with which he walked despite his circumstances. In a few hours, he would face the officers who thought they had broken his spirit by taking his hair. They had no idea he was coming to court not as a victim, but as living evidence of their wrongdoing, and he would make sure they saw exactly what they had done. The courthouse buzzed with tension. Reporters clustered on the steps, cameras ready. Community members formed a line that wrapped around the block, hoping to get one of the limited public seats. Some held signs. Others wore T-shirts with Andrew's face printed on them, the before picture showing his dreadlocks. Inside, officers Briggs and Wilson sat at the table with the department's lawyer. They looked confident, occasionally sharing whispered jokes. Briggs straightened his tie and arranged his papers carefully, rehearsing his explanation in his head. The department had backed their story. The haircut was standard procedure, nothing personal, just following protocol for health and safety. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Powell entered the courtroom. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose, scanned the packed room. "I understand there's significant public interest in this case. I will remind everyone that outbursts will not be tolerated in my courtroom." She nodded to the prosecutor. "The state may call the defendant." A door opened at the side of the courtroom. Officer Briggs leaned back confidently, expecting to see a diminished man, hunched and ashamed. He'd seen it before, how the system broke people's spirits, made them small. He expected Andrew to try to hide his shaved head, maybe with a hat the judge would make him remove. What happened instead silenced the entire room. Andrew walked in with measured steps, his back straight and head high. He wore a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, crisp white shirt, and polished shoes that caught the fluorescent lights. But it was his head that drew every eye, completely shaved, gleaming slightly from the coconut oil his mother had given him, impossible to ignore. He hadn't tried to hide it or grow it out or disguise it. Instead, he had made it visible, unmistakable evidence of what had been done to him. The confidence in his walk, the dignity in his face, it wasn't what Briggs had expected at all. The officer's smirk faltered, then fell completely as Andrew's eyes met his directly, unflinching. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, dropping his gaze to his hands. The department lawyer looked confused, as if the script he prepared suddenly made no sense. Andrew took his seat beside Diane, his posture perfect, his expression calm but resolute. The crowd behind him murmured, the energy in the room shifting dramatically. "Your Honor," Diane began, "before we proceed, I'd like to note for the record the physical state in which my client appears today. 3 days ago, while in police custody with no charges formally filed against him, officers forcibly shaved his dreadlocks, hair that held deep cultural and personal significance and that he had grown for over 10 years. Briggs leaned forward to whisper something to his lawyer, but the judge cut him off. "Officer Briggs, you'll have your turn to speak." Her eyes lingered on Andrew's shaved head, then moved to the officers. "I'm interested to hear the department's explanation." The department lawyer stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the department has protocols in place for hygiene and contraband checks. The officers were following standard procedure." "I see," said the judge, looking down at a document. "And can you direct me to where these procedures are outlined? Because I've reviewed the department manual and I can find no such policy." "Well, it's a matter of officer discretion," the lawyer stammered. "Discretion," the judge repeated, looking at Briggs and Wilson over her glasses. "Ms. Chen, please proceed with your client's account of events." Andrew stood and walked to the witness stand, feeling hundreds of eyes on him, especially those of Officers Briggs and Wilson. As he passed their table, he noticed Briggs wouldn't look at him anymore, while Wilson had developed a sudden interest in his shoes. The oath was administered, and Andrew took his seat. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fans turning above. "Mr. Andrew," Diane began, "please tell the court what happened the night of April 26th, starting with what brought you to be driving home at that hour." Andrew's voice was clear and steady as he began his account. "I had just finished hosting a fundraiser for the community center's new playground. We raised over $5,000 that night." As he spoke, Briggs fidgeted with his pen, clicking it repeatedly until his lawyer placed a hand over his to stop him. The officer had expected a broken man, someone easy to dismiss. Instead, with every calm, dignified word, Andrew was revealing not his own shame, but theirs. And the most damning evidence wasn't in the legal briefs or witness statements. It was sitting right there in the witness box, shining under the courtroom lights for everyone to see. Andrew's testimony continued, his voice steady as he recounted the events of that night. The courtroom hung on his every word. "After they took me to the cell, I asked to call my lawyer. They told me the phones were down. Later that night, around midnight, Officers Briggs and Wilson came with another officer. They said it was time for a hygiene inspection." Andrew paused, taking a deep breath. His hand moved unconsciously to his bare scalp. "They told me my hair was a hygiene risk. My cellmate Ray told them there was no such policy. He'd been through the system many times and never seen anything like it." Diane nodded encouragingly. "What happened next?" "They dragged me to another room. I didn't fight them. I know what happens when you resist officers. But I did tell them how important my locks were to me. I explained they were part of my cultural identity, that my grandmother had helped me start them before she passed." Andrew's eyes moved to Briggs, who was staring at the table, refusing to meet his gaze. Officer Briggs just laughed and said I should have thought about that before giving them trouble. Then they held me down while he used the clippers. Andrew's mother let out a soft sound from the gallery. The judge glanced at her but didn't interrupt. "How did you feel in that moment?" Diane asked gently. "Powerless," Andrew answered honestly. "But also like I was losing more than just hair." Each of those locks represented years of my life, memories, connection to my family history. The department lawyer stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is being overly dramatic about a simple haircut. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Judge Powell narrowed her eyes. Overruled. And, Counselor, I suggest you choose your words more carefully. Diane continued. After this happened, what was the officers' demeanor? They seemed pleased with themselves, Andrew said. Like they'd won something. Officer Wilson said, Not so special now, are you? As they took me back to my cell. When it was the department's turn for cross-examination, their lawyer approached cautiously. Mr. Andra, isn't it possible the officers were simply following what they believed was proper procedure? Andra looked at him steadily. If it was proper procedure, why wasn't it done during processing? Why was it done at midnight? Why wasn't it documented? And why, he said, his voice growing stronger, has no other inmate with long hair received the same treatment? The lawyer hesitated, thrown off by the direct questions. He adjusted his tie. Well, perhaps they had concerns specific to your situation. What concerns? Andrew asked, though it wasn't his place to question the lawyer. The judge interjected. I believe that's a fair question, Counselor. What specific concerns? The lawyer looked to Briggs for help, but the officer was still avoiding everyone's eyes. Let's move on, the lawyer muttered. Mr. Andra, would you say you were respectful to the officers during your arrest? I was cooperative and calm, Andrew replied. I asked why I was being arrested. I explained I was coming from a community fundraiser. I provided my license and registration exactly as requested. Yet the officers felt the need to search your vehicle. They claimed they smelled something suspicious. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The lawyer tried a different approach. The department has policies in place for safety reasons. Surely you understand that certain appearances can be. Objection. Diane stood up sharply. Counsel is making implications about my client's appearance without any factual basis. Sustained, the judge said firmly. The department lawyer seemed to realize he was only digging a deeper hole. No further questions, Your Honor. As Andrew returned to his seat, Officer Wilson leaned over to whisper something to Briggs. The movement caught Andrew's eye, and for a brief moment their gazes met. Wilson quickly looked away, but not before Andrew saw something unexpected in his face: shame. Diane called Ray to testify next. The older man described what he had witnessed, confirming Andrew's account and adding that in his 30 years of experience with the justice system, he had never seen such targeted treatment. When it came time for the officers to testify, the contrast was stark. Where Andrew had been composed and direct, Briggs was defensive and evasive. It was just department protocol, he insisted, though he couldn't point to any written policy when asked. And you've performed this protocol on other inmates with long hair? Diane asked. When necessary, Briggs mumbled. Can you name a single other inmate who received this treatment in the past year? Briggs couldn't. As the testimony continued, the truth became increasingly clear to everyone in the courtroom. What had happened to Andrew wasn't about hygiene or safety or protocol. The officer's own words and actions were revealing their true motivations, piece by piece. And through it all, Andrew sat with quiet dignity, his shaved head a silent but powerful testament that spoke louder than any testimony could. Judge Powell removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The courtroom had been in session for nearly 5 hours, but no one had left. The tension in the air was thick as everyone waited for her decision. Before I rule, she said, her voice cutting through the silence, I want to address something Officer Briggs said during his testimony. All eyes turned to Briggs, who stiffened in his chair. You stated, and I quote, it was just a haircut. I find that particularly troubling. The judge's gaze moved to Andra. What happened to this young man wasn't just a haircut. It was a deliberate attempt to strip him of his dignity, his identity, and his cultural heritage. She shuffled through her notes. The evidence presented today shows a clear pattern of targeting and mistreatment. The arrest itself lacked probable cause. The denial of a phone call violated department policy. And the forcible cutting of Mr. Andrew's hair was not only outside of any written protocol, but appears to have been done with malicious intent. The courtroom remained perfectly still as she continued. This court finds that the officers acted improperly, with bias, and in violation of Mr. Andrews' civil rights. All charges against him are dismissed. She paused, looking directly at the department lawyer. Furthermore, I am recommending a full Department of Justice investigation into patterns and practices at your department. The gallery erupted in cheers. Andrew's mother cried quietly, squeezing Tanya's hand. Diane turned to Andrew with a wide smile, but he remained calm, his expression one of quiet vindication rather than triumph. Additionally, the judge continued after banging her gavel for order. Officers Briggs and Wilson are placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. This court is adjourned. As people began filing out, reporters rushed to catch Andrew. Camera flashes lit up the courthouse steps as he emerged, flanked by his family and legal team. "Mr. Andrew, how do you feel about the ruling?" a reporter called out. Andrew looked at the sea of cameras, thinking carefully before speaking. "I feel seen," he finally said. "What happened to me in that jail cell was meant to make me invisible, to shame me. Instead, it made the truth visible for everyone to see." The questions continued as Andrew walked down the steps. "Will you sue the department? Are you angry at the officers? How long will it take your hair to grow back?" Andrew stopped, raising his hand for quiet. "Today isn't about money or punishment. It's about recognition, recognizing that what happened to me happens to many people who don't get a courtroom full of supporters or news cameras." He rubbed his hand over his smooth scalp. "My hair will grow back. But the system needs to change so that others don't have to lose pieces of themselves just to be treated fairly." 3 months later, Andrew stood before a different crowd. The community center was packed with people attending the launch of his new foundation, Dignity First, focused on reforming treatment of detainees in the criminal justice system. His hair had begun to grow back, a short later covering his head. He no longer looked like the man who had walked into that courtroom with a freshly shaved head, but he carried the same quiet strength. "What happened to me started with people who wanted to take my dignity," he told the crowd. "But it ended with a community that helped me reclaim it. Now we're going to help others do the same." In the back of the room stood a familiar face. Officer Wilson, not in uniform but in civilian clothes. After the hearing, he had resigned from the force and reached out to Andrew, wanting to make amends. Their conversations had been difficult but honest, and Wilson had become one of the Foundation's first volunteers. The internal investigation had led to department-wide reforms. New training programs used Andrew's case as an example of how bias can corrupt the system. Policies were put in place to protect detainees' cultural and religious expressions, including hair. As Andrew looked out at the diverse faces in the room, supporters, community members, former detainees, and even former officers, he felt something his grandmother had always talked about: the circle of healing that comes when truth is finally acknowledged. "They thought they were cutting away my strength," Andrew told a documentary filmmaker who was recording the event. "But instead, they revealed a different kind of strength, not just in me, but in everyone who stood up and said, 'This isn't right.'" He smiled, touching the new growth on his head. Hair grows back. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to face the truth, justice does too.